Welcome again to Ricardo's Time. Today we will talk about mysticism. I'm here again with Martin Hooss, the philosophical advisor of Ricardo's Time. Martin, what is mysticism?
Well, mysticism, I would say, is any form of trying to understand reality when you're not going by reason. So, mysticism ultimately is closely connected to faith and to religion. But ultimately, faith is only a form of emotionalism because we can use our mind in two different ways. So either, and that would be what Ayn Rand called the primacy of existence. So existence comes first. Existence exists as an absolute, and your mind is one of the facts of reality. So the stuff is out there, and we gain information through sense perception. And this is an automatic process. So if I, for instance, look at you, I get data. So of course, I can now close my eyes, and now I don't get data, but if I open my eyes, I cannot get rid of the fact that I am now getting information. Same goes, of course, for hearing, for smelling, and so on and so forth. The data comes automatically. And then we need to ask ourselves, what are we going to do with the data? On the primacy of existence, which Ayn Rand upholds, the data comes in and you use your mind to the best of your ability to identify the material you're getting, to integrate it by using logic. And then you can start building abstractions and so on and so forth, forming concepts. So that is the idea here. However, there's an alternative approach, and that is the mystical approach. Ultimately, there are three different variants, and Rand calls it the primacy of consciousness, which means that consciousness somehow has priority over existence. And this is a mystical approach because, as we will see now, we are no longer using our minds for the right purpose to integrate the material, but we are in effect perverting our minds. So the first example would be the mystical notion of the primacy of consciousness, which means God or the prime mover creates the world, and consequently, consciousness is first, before existence. So I can use my consciousness, and I see something is out there, I'm afraid of it, or there's danger, but I don't start using my mind to solve the problem. I rather go to church, and I use my consciousness to pray to the superconsciousness, to God. Since God has priority over existence, He can somehow change reality. To give you very practical examples, when they had the wildfires I think it was in California, yes, around 15 years ago, Rick Perry was governor of Texas. And they asked Rick Perry, what should we do in order to extinguish those wildfires? And Rick Perry said, you'll just be good Christians and we will sit here around in Texas and pray to God and we will pray the wildfires out of existence. That would be mysticism. It would be going not by reason, but by your emotions, in this case expressed in faith. Now we have the second form of the primacy of consciousness, which Rand again rejects, and that really is introduced by French philosopher Descartes. Because for Descartes, ultimately, consciousness comes first. He talked about the prior certainty of consciousness. By what he meant that by introspection, you can see that your consciousness exists, but you can never be sure that anything around you exists. It might exist, it might not exist. And here, subjectivism enters the philosophical scene, because Descartes, in effect, said that our mind is not there to understand reality, but to create it. That we can all create our own virtual realities, you could always say, and we all live in our own virtual bubbles. And then Kant comes around, Immanuel Kant, German philosopher, with the third variant of the primacy of consciousness, which is the social variant. So according to Immanuel Kant, the idea is it's not only individual minds that come up with their own realities, but it's now groups who have group identity and who act as groups by thinking with a collective mind and who come up with collective truths, truth with lowercase t, stuff like that. All of that would be mysticism because you're not using your mind correctly, because you want to believe in something for which there is no proof, and you're perverting your mind by inventing fantasies which do not exist. And God, of course, is a classical example of that. There is no proof for God, there is no evidence for it, and people go on believing and believing and believing. So in short, the point is, you use your mind correctly, you're being reality-oriented, you want to understand reality. If you pervert it, you're being a mystic in effect. You're using your mind not to understand reality, but in order to escape reality, to start inventing fantasies. I would consider that mysticism.
Great. So you talk about mysticism and the lack of evidence. So what about those people who say that they use their mind and they have evidence that God exists, for instance? I remember Ayn Rand said that there's all the proof, presented are always incomplete, so there is no real proof. Can you give me maybe some examples that maybe you hear around people that say, no, I use my mind and I see evidence there that proof exists?
Yeah, first of all, there is no evidence, just to put that on the record. And Rand said that very clearly. If you want to learn more about that, she was on the Donahue show and she talked about that there and she made her point very clear. Now, the point is when people talk about the fact that they have evidence, they cannot prove that. They cannot point at something in reality and say, here is my evidence, or I have met God, let me take you to him and you can have a chat with him, That would be evidence. We don't have that. Often people talk about something, they get something, an information in their dreams, and then they think it was a revelation by God or something like that. Or others have near-death experiences and they think they met God. Now, I am a philosopher, not a scientist, and this is a question which science has to answer, and probably also one would, in many cases, need a psychologist or a psychiatrist. But I think what people are doing, I would name two things, and there's more to say about that. But A, of course, what are you doing in your dreams? You are somehow subconsciously or unconsciously coping with the experiences you have made consciously. And then people think that they're having kind of revelation, but they're really just dealing with their subconscious, which they have suppressed during the day. And the second, and perhaps even more important mechanism is the following. And that was already pointed out, by the way, by Sigmund Freud in his article, The Uncanny. Is that, for instance, you go through the streets and suddenly you realize that you see the number 13 very often. And then something happens and it is the number 13 and it is something bad. Now what people then don't realize is they have seen the number 12 the same amount of times. And then they are so aware of the number 13 that whenever they see the number 13, they keep focusing on that and they think God is sending me signals or something like that. But they don't see that they see the number 8 or 15 the same amount of times, but it's not in their focus, so they don't focus on that. So they are basically not really dealing with reality, they are afraid, and because they are so in focus on that one number, they see it more often and they think it's a sign by God, but it's really not. Or another thing is, what happens to a lot of people, I heard that, is they say, oh my God, that certain song is always with me. Whenever I have a good moment, I hear that song and it's there, so God is sending it to me to tell me I'm on the right way. What they're ignoring is they hear a lot of other songs when they're in a good mood, and often, for the most time, probably 95%, they're in a good mood and they don't listen to that song. It's not played on the radio. But since by sheer coincidence, some things happen to a certain degree, people are no longer understanding that there's chance involved and there's some regularity also, but they think there's some regularity which is imposed by a prime mover.
Yeah, I know those exactly examples. I have experienced that in my life. I mean, not myself, but people near me. So just to make it clear, you would say that mysticism is anti-reason.
Completely, yes. If you want to elaborate, that is a short answer, right? But let us just have a look at Thomas Aquinas, who was a brilliant philosopher. Aquinas is an interesting case because he wanted to make that fusion of faith and reason. Because what was his aim? To prove God. That is the faith element in him. What was his method? It was completely Aristotelian. That's the reason element in him. So what Aquinas did for a long time is trying to prove the existence of God. And what he did is he used the Aristotelian method. He used logic, he looked at reality, and ultimately he had to give up. And this is the point here, Either you go by reason or you go by faith. And let me give you maybe a more practical example then, because I know you love practical examples. Let us say that you find some mole on your body and you think, well, according to what I see on Google, this might be cancer. What are the options you have? Well, either you use your mind, you look that up, you figure out this might be cancer. So what your rational mind would tell you is go to a doctor, see what's happening, and try to prevent the worst from happening. If you're going by faith, what you're doing is you jump in your car, but you don't go to the hospital, but you drive to church in order to pray cancer out of existence. But again, your consciousness is not there to recreate reality, to rewrite reality, and you cannot rewrite the facts of reality through your consciousness. You need to accept what is. And if you do accept what is, if you use your mind, you're a rational person. If you do not accept what is, but if you try through some other mechanism, be it faith or feelings or fear or whatsoever, to get rid of something which is there by trying to change it, although it's not possible, then you're a mystic.
Great. So I also would like to know why it's so hard for people who accepted mysticism, right? To get out of religion, or for instance, here in Latin America, it's really hard for them to get out of Catholicism.
Yeah. I know a lot of people from the United States who deal with that problem, who get to know objectivism and who come from usually rather Republican households. So they are not hardcore capitalists, but that move is pretty simple. They become hardcore capitalists, they get rid of the Hayekian elements. They understand Rand's morality quite quickly. They understand egoism is good. They understand why. They also start using their minds. But overcoming religion and on a metaphysical level changing one's outlook is the hardest thing there is. And why is that? Because ultimately, most people are very afraid of dying. And what religion offers them is very much eternity. Again, there is no proof for heaven, but this is so deep-seated that fear of death, and you are indoctrinated by your parents, by the church, and so on, by the priests from early on, that you better be a good person, and then you have an endless life. You will live forever, and you will live in bliss in heaven, A lot of misconceptions there, but that is what young children are taught, and of course they don't see through those misconceptions. So they want to live forever, and I understand why. And getting rid of the idea that you will die and this life is over is really hard for a lot of people. So this is why they go back through religion and they can't get out of it, because ultimately they're driven by fear.
Don't you think it's also an emotional, there is an emotional argument that people, when they get into religion, they put it like their beliefs is something very personal, and it's really hard to get out of them because it's like, it's part of their life, religion, in a sense.
Ultimately, as I said before, faith is always a matter of emotion, because you are not going by reason, but you are going by emotion. So whenever we enter into the field of faith, this is a form of emotionalism per se. But yeah, I think what you're saying is right, and the point is what I said before. A lot of people, especially in the United States, or also here in Latin America, where Christianity is like 90% in a lot of countries, those children are brought to church when they are like 2 to 3 years old. They are completely indoctrinated by those ideas. So I think that early emotional appeal which is there which is so dangerous. And this is why a lot of people have problems getting out, because they always accept it as a truism. They accept the idea that God is up there in the same way as saying the heaven is blue. So to get rid of such an idea which is almost held as an axiom is really hard. It takes a lot of thinking. There are the emotions, as you said, involved, plus the fear.
All right. One last question. You talk about capitalism. There are so many people that say they are capitalists, but they think that capitalism is compatible with religion, right? Is capitalism compatible with religion?
Certainly not, and for many reasons. Let us start with what I consider the most important one. That is the ethical reason. Now, if you look at Christianity, what is their ethical conviction? It is altruism. It's the idea that you have to sacrifice yourself for other people. That is what the Christians believe in. On the other hand, when you have capitalism, properly defined, expresses the morality of self-interest. And the morality of self-interest means that each and every person has a right to exist for their own sakes and to live their own lives according to their own preferences, as long as they do not initiate force against other people. What morality expresses and defends is man's mind, that each man, each woman has a right to use their own mind, to figure out what is a rational, important aim for him or her, and how to give form to that aim. What are the rational, the right, the adequate means for that aim? Now, here you have the clash. Christianity says you are a sacrificial animal who has no right to exist for your own sake. You have a duty to sacrifice yourself for others. Then you have the capitalist morality, the morality of self-interest, which tells you have a right to exist for your own sake. You have rights which no one can take away from you, and you have no duty whatsoever toward your fellow man. I mean, the United States of America capitalism is about the pursuit of your own happiness, not about sacrifice for other people. It's pursuing your own happiness, becoming happy. How do you want to combine that with a morality which tells you that you are a sacrificial animal? And in addition, here's another problem. That defense of capitalism, call it the theological defense. So defense of saying capitalism is the good system because it was chosen by God, is also very detrimental to capitalism. Because in effect, it will promote socialism and communism, and already have. If you say capitalism is good because God chose that system for us as free people, well, what is the consequence of that? We said before, it's either faith or reason. If you say you have no other argument for capitalism than the argument based on faith, then it means that you cannot put forth any rational arguments for capitalism, and it means, per se, by default, that reason is with the communists and with the socialists, which is, of course, not true, but it is precisely what this theological argument for capitalism suggests.
All right. Thank you very much, Martin, for being here again.
Thanks, it was a pleasure.
Absolutely. See you next time. Thank you. Bye.